Introduction. In the last article, we showed the sense in which emergent complexity means phenomena like good, evil, and beauty are real, even within a strictly physical universe. What, though, does this poetic materialist worldview have to say on the topics of consciousness, the self, and free will? Let's find out. Theories of consciousness. The mystery of consciousness has spawned several explanatory theories. We'll consider 4. Panpsychism is the view that consciousness is a fundamental property of matter, present even at the level of subatomic particles. It distinguishes between simple experience, phenomenal consciousness, and complex thought, cognition, suggesting human consciousness arises from the combination of many proto-conscious particles in the brain. Panpsychism does not imply objects like rocks have thoughts. Rather, it argues raw experience exists throughout all matter. However, this idea is currently unfalsifiable and lacks scientific evidence, making it more of a philosophical stance than a testable theory. Substance dualism, also known as Cartesian dualism, holds that the body is physical while the mind is a separate, mental substance. Descartes believed the soul influenced the brain via the pineal gland. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia challenged this, arguing causation requires contact. A non-physical soul cannot move physical matter. She famously wrote, "It makes more sense to say the soul is physical than to say a ghost can push a brick." Modern physics supports her view. Without physical energy, an immaterial soul cannot affect the physical world. Confronted with felt experience, the redness of a rose or the sting of a headache, Cartesian dualism and panpsychism reach the same conclusion. The standard inventory of the universe must be incomplete. Many have a strong intuition that normal matter, defined strictly by properties like mass, charge, and spin, is incapable of generating felt experience, no matter how complexly it is arranged. To bridge this explanatory gap, they introduce a new, irreducible element. For the dualist, this takes the form of a separate substance entirely, a non-physical mind that interacts with the machine. For the panpsychist, it is a fundamental property stitched into the fabric of matter itself. Rather than accepting that consciousness might emerge from the intricate architecture of the material brain, they solve the mystery of the ghost in the machine by proposing that consciousness is not an output, but an input. Epiphenomenalism. The polar opposite perspective is taken by epiphenomenalists. They take the view that consciousness is the steam coming off the steam engine of brain activity. Per epiphenomenalism, you are a spectator in your own life, mistakenly believing you are the pilot. Our experience of self provides a window into what is going on in the brain engine below, but as a mere spectator. Contrary to how things seem to us, the self in fact has no causal power over the machine. Libet experiment. Famously, in the 1980s, Benjamin Libet showed that the brain apparently decides to move a finger 350 milliseconds before the subject felt the urge to move it. The implication? Your subconscious brain decides and then sends the conscious self, a mere spectator with no causal power of its own, a notification. This triggers a false felt experience about what led to the finger movement. The Libet experiment does appear to provide evidence for epiphenomenalism. Compatibilism. But in 2012, an alternative interpretation of Libet's results was offered, based on a fourth theory of consciousness, compatibilism. Doubt was cast on whether the signal Libet detected corresponded with a decision by the brain machine. Libet's results could also be interpreted as follows. The self is involved at the very beginning. You consciously form a general intention to act. analogous to a surfer deciding to get in the water and paddle out. The self sets the goal, I will press the button soon. Once the general intention is set, the brain waits for suitable conditions to eventuate. It rides the waves of neural activity until one comes along that facilitates the intention developing into action. The signal Libet saw did not correspond with a decision. It was the natural hum of the brain fluctuating upwards. In looking for a signal, Libet always looked backward from the moment of movement. Because movement only happens when neural activity spikes high enough to cross an action threshold, looking backward will inevitably reveal a rising wave. The rise in neural activity detected by Libet was not a decision to move. It just determined the moment the movement happened. According to epiphenomenalism, the brain machine decides, and 350 milliseconds later, the self is notified. According to compatibilism, the felt urge is delayed from the formation of the general intention, but that delay is part of the plan. You, the self, authorized the brain to pull the trigger whenever the patterns of neural activity next allowed for it. How does compatibilism describe the self? Consider a whirlpool in a river. While the individual water molecules always follow the laws of physics, the shape and dynamics of the whirlpool constrain where they can go. A water molecule entering the whirlpool cannot just flow downstream in a straight line. It is captured by the macrostructure. The macrostructure, the whirlpool pattern, forces the molecule to circulate. The whirlpool persists even as individual water molecules cycle through it and leave. In the brain, your self is the whirlpool. The electrochemical signals are the water molecules. The pattern of synaptic weights and network connections, built over a lifetime, forces the brain signals to follow certain patterns and not others. The self is the complex architecture of the brain, the riverbank, the eddies, the whirlpools, that cause the neurons to fire in certain sequences and not others. If a small boat wanders into a whirlpool and is pulled under, we are entirely justified in saying, the whirlpool sank the boat. It is a macro-level cause producing a macro-level effect. To deny this, to insist that whirlpools do not exist and that only trillions of water molecules exist, is to lose the ability to describe reality effectively. The whirlpool is real because it is a stable, predictive pattern that endures even as the water rushing through it is replaced every second. The self is precisely this kind of pattern. It is a stable, resonant architecture of synaptic weights and neural connections. When you decide to raise your arm, it is the self, that complex, swirling architecture that causes the action, just as surely as the whirlpool causes the boat to sink. The structure of your memories, desires, and personality dictates the flow of the electrical signals, channeling them toward a specific outcome. To say, I raised my arm, is not a convenient fiction. It is the most accurate macro-level description of the event. Crucially, this macro-level causal power requires no magic influence over the micro-level. If we zoom in on the whirlpool, we find nothing at play bullying the water molecules into submission. Every single molecule is simply obeying the standard laws of physics. Similarly, in the brain, every electron and ion is strictly following the laws of physics, blind to the grand plan of the self. Scientific evidence. If the self has macro-level causal power, we should be able to predict that certain mental activities involving the self can cause macro-level physical changes in the brain. Here are 3 landmark experiments where that kind of prediction was made and verified. 1. The brain lock prediction, OCD and self-directed neuroplasticity. The scientist was Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz from UCLA, in the journal Archives of General Psychiatry, 1996. This study used PET scans to show that patients who responded substantially to a specific 4-step cognitive behavioral therapy developed by Dr. Schwartz had significant changes in their neural pathways, particularly in the orbital frontal cortex and caudate nucleus. 2. The spider phobia prediction, CBT rewiring. The scientists were Paquette, Levesque, Mansour, and Beauregard in the journal Neuroimage, 2003. They predicted that cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which is entirely conversational and mental, would dismantle the physical neural signature of fear in phobic patients. They took patients with severe spider phobia and intervened with 4 weeks of CBT, changing the belief structure. The verified result was that the changes made at the mind level through CBT within a psychotherapeutic context are able to functionally rewire the brain. 3. The alpha-theta prediction, neurofeedback. The researchers were Gruzelia and Egner, Imperial College London, in the journal International Journal of Psychophysiology, 2004/2005. They predicted that if the self is a pilot, it should be able to learn to steer its own brainwaves when given a dashboard, biofeedback. Musicians were shown a screen representing their brainwaves, alpha/theta ratios. They were told to use their mind to move a bar on the screen, which required them to alter their fundamental neural oscillations. Not only could subjects learn to voluntarily control their brainwaves, something previously thought to be automatic, but this mental steering led to a verified improvement in their musical performance ratings by independent judges. Felt experience. So, we've now given the poetic materialist description of the self. It is a real macro-level phenomenon, a stable, resonant brain architecture of synaptic weights and neural connections. We've also presented evidence of the self's macro-level causal power. But what about consciousness? Felt experience, according to poetic materialists, is simply what it is like to have a self from the inside. Selves come packaged with felt experience. You can't have one without the other. Consider what happens under anesthesia. As an analogy, imagine the self to be like music. If a CD player is paused, the music doesn't go somewhere. It just ceases to be played. The music recorded on the CD, your synaptic weights, is still there, so the moment the CD player is switched back on, the music resumes playing from where it left off. Under anesthesia, the self is paused. You are a candle that has been blown out. The fact that you can be relit is a testament to the ability of your brain hardware to reboot and carry on. Free will. The term free will is arguably one of the most confusing and baggage-laden terms in the history of human thought. Free will is intuitively taken to mean an ability to have done otherwise, which implies an ability to somehow stand outside the deterministic physical laws which, at the macro level, constrain everything. This version of free will relies on a magical exemption from physics for those possessing it, a freedom from the causal chain. Quantum mechanics does not offer such a magical exemption. Micro-level quantum effects, like superposition and entanglement, are incredibly fragile, surviving only in isolation. As soon as a quantum system interacts with its environment, heat, light, air molecules, it undergoes a process called decoherence. The environment forces the system to shed its quantum possibilities and settle into a definite, classical state. A golf ball flying through the air is interacting with photons and air molecules trillions of times a second. This constant interaction suppresses any micro-level quantum indeterminacy at the macro level. Therefore, the indeterminacy at the bottom does not break the determinism at the top. We live in the classical limit of quantum mechanics, where the probabilities of the subatomic realm have smoothed out into the rigid, dependable laws of classical physics. The chaos is still there, deep down, but the sheer scale of the macro world renders it invisible, leaving us with a reality that looks, feels, and acts deterministic. Causal chain. Every moment that unfolds is not a fresh start, but the inevitable byproduct of a multi-layered causal chain that stretches back unbroken to the beginning of everything. If we could view the universe from the outside, we would see a single, uninterrupted trajectory from the Big Bang to the firing of specific neurons in your brain right now. When you stand at a crossroads, deciding whether to speak or stay silent, to run or to fight, the outcome is already determined. The decision you are about to make was forged by the collision of your genetics, your history, your environment, and the workings of your immediate biochemical machinery. That your decisions are determined does not mean your self is irrelevant. It simply means you are a component, a highly complex one, within the causal chain of events that led to that decision. When the self is involved with deciding, it necessarily involves consideration of alternatives, a process that must be allowed to play out before we can arrive at the predetermined but unforeseeable outcome. It is the self doing what the self does that generates the felt experience of will. Like consciousness, the feeling of having free will is what it is like to have a self that is in the process of playing its part in the causal chain, a self that is in the process of deciding. When we cling to the idea of free will, while also accepting that the macro-level universe is deterministic, we are forced to radically redefine the words until they mean something entirely different. We're forced to engage in a semantic bait and switch, telling people they have free will, only to later define it in ways that are in conflict with their intuition. For example, philosopher Daniel Dennett defined free will as a biological competence that evolved over time. He regarded it as a measure of control and complexity. A bacterium has almost zero free will. A dog has some. A human has a lot. It is more intellectually honest to discard the term altogether. The words free will set up a false binary. Either we have this magical capacity to break the laws of physics, or we are meaningless automatons. This dichotomy obscures the fascinating reality. We are not separate from the causal chain. We are complex, high-density knots within it. Agency. Replacing free will with agency clarifies the landscape immediately. Agency is not a theological claim, it is a description of system capability. Dennett's free will more aptly named. It acknowledges that while a rock, a bacterium, and a human are all subject to deterministic laws, they function differently. A rock has zero agency. It is entirely passive to external forces. A human has high agency. We possess internal models of the world, future simulating capabilities, and the capacity to inhibit immediate impulses in service of long-term goals. In a deterministic world, agency does not mean the system could have acted differently given the exact same past. It means the system's action was determined in part by its own complex processing, rather than externally by immediate environmental forces, or internally through simple reflexes. To make this definition rigorous, we can break agency down into three functional requirements. If a system possesses these three, it has agency. Firstly, for agency to exist, there must be a preferred state. A rock has no preference. It falls where gravity dictates. An agent, however, has an objective function, e.g., maintain body temperature, win the chess game, write the book. Secondly, there is the intelligence aspect. The agent must contain an internal representation of the external world. It runs simulations, if I do X, Y will happen, before acting. Finally, there is inhibitory control. The system must be able to suppress a high probability, low-cost action, an impulse, in favor of a low probability, high-cost action that better serves the long-term goal. Philosophical responses. Ditching the term free will and adopting the concept of agency instead moves us from a binary metaphysical debate, we do or don't have free will, whatever that may be defined to be, to a practical spectrum of agentic competence. Humans possess brains that have macro-level phenomena we call selves, stable, resonant architectures of synaptic weights and neural connections that afford agency. Felt experience is simply what it is like to have a self from the inside. Selves come packaged with felt experience. You can't have one without the other. Although it feels otherwise, whenever we make a decision, we didn't have the freedom to decide otherwise. Decision outcomes are predetermined by the antecedent causal chain, including the part ourselves play in that chain. We did, though, and indeed we must, for to be conscious necessitates being an agent, demonstrate agency in playing our part in that unfolding of events. An unfolding which, although determined, was impossible to predict. The self is a biological system with agency that feels like it's free. Historically, philosophers who accepted this premise didn't just nod and move on. They had intense, often emotional reactions to what this meant. Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza, 17th century, is perhaps the most famous rigorist on this topic. He fully accepted that we are part of the causal chain of nature, with no special soul to break the laws of physics. He imagined a stone being thrown through the air. He wrote that if the stone were conscious, it would believe that it was choosing to fly. It would feel the agency of its trajectory and say, "I am flying because I want to." For Spinoza, the felt experience of freedom is just ignorance of the causes that drive us. By understanding that, we can stop fighting reality, stop regretting the past, "I should have done differently," or fearing the future. His reaction was amor fati, love fate. If you are the river, why struggle against the current? David Hume. David Hume, 18th century. Hume argued that when people expect free will, they are asking for magic. They are asking for their actions to be uncaused. But if your actions were uncaused, they would be random spasms, not choices. Are you in handcuffs? No. Is anyone holding a gun to your head? No. Then Hume says you are free. The fact that your will was determined by your neurons, or the whirlpool, doesn't matter. Hume's reaction was to dismiss the panic. He basically said, don't look at the micro-level physics. Look at the macro-level situation. If you can do what you want, you're free enough. Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, 19th century, had a much darker reaction. He said, man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. He felt this made us slaves to our biological drives. We are driven by hunger, lust, and desire, a situation which we didn't choose. This realization led him to a deep compassion. Since no one chose their personality, their whirlpool, you cannot truly hate a bad person any more than you hate a storm. His reaction was to treat the self not as a hero, but as a blameless victim. Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, late 19th century, argued that there is no self separate from the actions. He wrote, there is no being behind doing, effecting, becoming. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything. He saw the self as a hierarchy of drives, hunger, intellect, pride, fighting for control. The feeling of freedom is just the feeling of the victorious drive. Instead of despairing, Nietzsche saw this as a creative opportunity. His reaction was to affirm the way things are and seize the opportunity to style one's character through great actions. Conclusion. We can arrive at a precise scientific understanding of what we are, a resonant architecture of synaptic weights, a whirlpool in the river of brain activity. But this intellectual clarity offers surprisingly little instruction on how to go about existing. Knowing that your frustration is a transient neural state does not make it sting any less, nor does understanding the determinism of your neural circuitry relieve the crushing disappointment of having made a poor decision. Since the only way to escape the illusion of free will is to exit the causal chain entirely through anesthesia or death, we are left with only one maneuver. We must accept the stubborn reality, embrace our place in the causal chain, and simply carry on with the business of being a conscious agent, hopefully enjoying the type of good enough freedom Hume described. Since there is no clear from first principles answer on how to live, the field of philosophy is not just valid. It is required to plug this gap and attempt to meet our subjective need for purpose.